The once mighty kingdom was now a graveyard of dreams. Sir Eadric rode through the smoldering remains of his homeland, his heart heavy with loss. Stone walls that had once shielded his people now crumbled under the weight of war's cruel hand. The banners of his ancestors lay tattered in the wind, silent witnesses to the kingdom's downfall. He had fought bravely, but what good was a warrior's valor when there was no home left to protect? His journey back had been filled with desperate hope, but the truth struck like a blade. He was no longer a knight of a thriving realm, but an exiled warrior with nothing but his armor and sword. The echoes of battle still rang in his ears, but now there was only silence. The faces of those he had sworn to protect haunted his every step, their ghosts lingering in the ruins. He clenched the hilt of his blade, knowing he could not stay. With no purpose left in the ashes, Eadric turned east, where the sun painted the sky in hues of blood and fire. Somewhere beyond the forests and distant hills, perhaps fate held another chapter for him. His warrior journey was not over, even if his kingdom had fallen. He was still a knight, forged in battle, hardened by loss. A knight without a home, but not without a will to fight. As he rode past the last remnants of his fief, his mind wandered to the days of glory, when he had marched alongside loyal men, his sword a beacon of justice. Now, justice felt like a distant memory, swallowed by the hunger of war. He was no longer a protector, nor a leader. He was merely a survivor of a medieval survival tale, an outcast in a world that had no place for him. The wind howled through the broken towers, whispering tales of kingdoms lost and warriors forgotten. But Eadric refused to be forgotten. The road ahead was uncertain, but he would carve his path with steel and determination. He had heard whispers of distant lands, of noble courts seeking warriors and mercenaries. Yet deep inside, he longed for something more, a reason beyond battle, beyond survival. The eastern roads were treacherous, winding through dense forests and unknown territories. He knew the dangers that lurked in the shadows, bandits, wild beasts, and perhaps even worse. Yet, what was a knight without a challenge? If the gods had cast him into exile, he would turn his exile into legend. He would not fade into obscurity, not while he still had breath in his lungs and strength in his arms. Nightfall approached, casting long shadows over his path. He pulled his cloak tighter, the cold seeping into his bones, reminding him that he was alone. Yet solitude had become his only companion. The fire of vengeance and sorrow burned low in his chest, replaced by a quiet resolve. He had lost his home, but perhaps beyond these darkened lands, he would find something worth fighting for. As the last light of the day faded, he caught sight of the looming forest ahead. The towering trees stretched endlessly, their secrets hidden beneath a thick canopy of leaves. It was the kind of place where danger thrived, where only the strongest survived. His grip tightened on his reins. This was not the end of his story. It was merely the beginning of another battle in the kingdom, one that would lead him toward an unknown fate.
If you like exciting medieval stories, you can help us by subscribing, activating the bell, and leaving your like.
The forest swallowed Eadric whole, its towering trees blotting out the moonlight. Each hoofbeat on the damp earth echoed through the silence, a reminder that he was alone in this vast and unforgiving land. The air smelled of moss and damp wood, thick with the whispers of unseen creatures. This was no place for the weak. A knight without a kingdom had no choice but to survive, and survival in such a place meant staying alert. He dismounted, feeling the weight of exhaustion press upon him. The day's ride had drained him, and even a warrior needed rest. He found a clearing beneath an ancient oak, its roots curling like fingers into the soil. As he built a small fire, the shadows danced on the edges of his vision. His warrior journey had taken him far, but something about this place felt wrong. The silence was too deep, too heavy. Then came the growl, low, guttural, and close. His hand shot to his sword before his mind could process the danger. The flickering fire cast eerie shapes on the trees, and in the shifting light, he saw them. Eyes, glowing like embers in the night, circling him in the darkness. Wolves, not one or two, but a pack, their hunger visible in the way they moved, cautious yet eager, testing their prey. Eadric's grip tightened around his blade. This was not the battlefield he had trained for, but the fight was the same. Kill or be killed. The largest of the beasts lunged first, teeth bared, its attack swift as lightning. Eadric sidestepped, driving his sword into its side, feeling the warm rush of blood coat his hand. The wolf yelped and fell, but the others hesitated only for a moment before closing in. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he fought. The fire crackled behind him, casting long shadows as he slashed and dodged. One beast leaped for his throat, but he caught it mid-air with the edge of his sword, sending it tumbling into the dirt. Another snapped at his leg, tearing into the leather of his boot before he drove a dagger into its skull. They were relentless, but so was he. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, time blurred in the chaos. One by one, the wolves fell until only silence remained. Eadric stood, breath ragged, his blade slick with blood. His arms ached, but he was alive. His medieval survival instincts had kept him breathing, but barely. He knew he couldn't stay here. The smell of blood would draw more predators soon enough. He had to move. He retrieved his horse, its frightened whinnies echoing through the trees. The beast had been spared from the fight, but fear still clung to it. He soothed the animal with a firm hand, whispering words of reassurance. Together, they ventured deeper into the forest, leaving behind the bodies of the fallen. The battle in the kingdom may have ended, but here in the wilderness, every night was a war of its own. As the trees thickened and the cold seeped deeper into his bones, he felt the sharp sting of fatigue. His thoughts drifted toward the unknown road ahead. This journey was proving harder than he had expected, and he had barely begun. He had survived the wolves, but what awaited him further into the shadows of the forest? Eadric pressed on through the dense forest, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. The night's battle had left him weary, but he had no time to dwell on exhaustion. Every rustling leaf, every distant howl reminded him that the wilderness showed no mercy. His horse moved cautiously beneath him, its ears flicking at unseen threats. They had survived the wolves, but fate was rarely so kind twice in a row. The path was treacherous, roots twisting like serpents beneath fallen leaves. His horse stepped carefully, but even the most seasoned war steed was no match for nature's hidden traps. Without warning, its hoof caught on a gnarled root, sending the beast crashing forward. Eadric barely had time to react before he was thrown from the saddle, the world spinning as he struck the ground hard. Pain exploded through his ribs as his body hit the unforgiving earth. For a moment, the world was nothing but silence and pain. His horse let out a distressed whinny, struggling to rise. Eadric forced himself to breathe, the sharp sting of bruised ribs reminding him that he was still alive. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself up, his vision blurring. He had suffered worse on the battlefield, but that did not mean he would walk away unscathed. His warrior journey had taken another cruel turn. From the shadows, unseen eyes watched. Isolde had been tracking him for some time now, observing, waiting. She had seen men like him before, warriors with nothing left but their swords and their ghosts. He reeked of war and sorrow, an exile in a land that had no place for him. Yet something about him made her linger. Perhaps it was the way he refused to stay down, even when the world knocked him to his knees. She stepped into the clearing, her hood casting shadows over her face. "You're injured," she said, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge rather than sympathy. Eadric turned, hand on his sword, but the pain in his side made his grip falter. He studied her, cloaked, cautious, yet unafraid. A healer, perhaps, or something else entirely. In a land where trust was a currency long spent, he knew better than to lower his guard. "I've survived worse," he muttered, but the blood seeping through his tunic told a different story. His horse, still struggling, let out a soft, pained sound. Isolde's gaze flickered toward the beast, then back to him. "You won't make it far like this," she said simply. "Neither will your horse." She knelt beside the animal, her hands moving with practiced ease. A medieval survival tale was unfolding before him, one where the hands of a stranger might decide whether he lived or died. Eadric watched as she worked, murmuring quiet words in a language he did not recognize. The horse stilled under her touch, its labored breathing easing. Magic? Or simply the skill of someone who had spent her life tending to the broken? He did not know, but he did know one thing. He owed her now. And debts, even small ones, had a way of shaping fate. As the fire crackled between them later that night, he studied her from across the flames. Who was this woman, this healer from an ancient lineage? And why had she chosen to help him, a knight with no banner? He would have his answers soon enough. But for now, he had little choice but to trust her hands. Whether they would heal him or lead him to another battle in the kingdom remained to be seen. Eadric awoke to the scent of herbs and the distant calls of morning birds. His body ached, but the sharp edge of pain had dulled. Isolde had worked through the night, tending to his wounds and those of his horse. He watched her move with quiet precision, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. She had saved him, that much was clear. But why? And what did she expect in return? A medieval love story had no place in a world where survival came before sentiment. "You can ride," she said, not asking but stating. "We should leave." He raised a brow at her certainty. "We?" He had spent years fighting alongside men bound by oaths and honor. This woman, though, was a mystery wrapped in silence. Isolde simply nodded. "The road ahead isn't safe, and neither are you." "You need me," he scoffed, yet he could not argue. His warrior journey was far from over, and for now, she was his best chance at making it through the wilderness alive. They moved through the dense woodland, the air thick with the damp scent of earth. Isolde walked with the confidence of someone who had traveled these paths before, her steps light, deliberate. Eadric followed, his eyes scanning the trees for movement. The battle in the kingdom had been fought with steel and strategy, but out here, war came in the form of hunger, isolation, and the lurking eyes of desperate men. The attack came suddenly, as such things always did. A rustle in the underbrush, the snap of a twig, then chaos. Raiders poured from the trees, their blades gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Eadric reacted on instinct, his sword already in his hand before the first man reached him. Steel clashed, the force reverberating through his arms. He moved with practiced precision, dodging, striking, cutting through flesh and bone. Isolde was no helpless bystander. She moved like a shadow, weaving between the chaos, a dagger flashing in her hand. She was no warrior, but she knew how to survive. One raider lunged for her, but she ducked, slashing his thigh before Eadric finished the job with a well-placed strike. Blood stained the forest floor, the scent of iron thick in the air. The medieval survival instinct was in both of them. Though their skills differed, their will to live was the same. The fight was short, brutal, and final. Eadric wiped his blade clean as he surveyed the fallen men. Bandits, desperate and reckless. This was not a battlefield, yet death had followed him here nonetheless. He turned to Isolde, expecting fear in her eyes. Instead, he found something else: resolve. "You've killed before," he said, more observation than question. She met his gaze without hesitation. "And you?" Her words held no accusation, only truth. The silence stretched between them, thick with understanding. Whatever she had been before, she was no stranger to danger. And whatever he had been before, he was now a man without a home, forced to fight for every step forward. Their fragile alliance had been forged in blood, and whether they had chosen it or not, they were bound by survival. As they looted the fallen for supplies, Eadric knew one thing. He had underestimated this woman. She was more than a healer, more than a mystery wrapped in quiet strength. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, and he would find out what it was. But for now, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, there was only one certainty. Their journey together was far from over. The fire crackled between them, its glow casting flickering shadows on the trees. The night was still, but not silent. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the quiet breath of two souls who had seen too much. Eadric sharpened his blade with slow, methodical strokes, though his mind was elsewhere. The battle in the kingdom had long since ended, yet the war inside him remained. Across the flames, Isolde sat with her knees drawn close, staring into the embers as if searching for something long lost. "You're not just a healer," he finally said, his voice breaking the quiet. It wasn't a question. She exhaled slowly, as if weighing whether to answer. "And you're not just a knight," she countered. The corner of his mouth twitched, but there was no humor in it. She was right. Neither of them were simply what they appeared to be. They were remnants of something greater, fragments of stories that no longer existed. A medieval romance had no place in a world carved by steel and sorrow. Yet here they were, bound by fate and firelight. Isolde reached into the folds of her cloak, pulling out a small pendant, a simple piece of silver, worn by time. "This belonged to my mother," she said, her voice distant. "She was the last of our lineage before me, before they were hunted." Eadric's grip on his sword tightened. He had seen such things before, entire bloodlines erased, not by time, but by the cruelty of men. Why were they hunted? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Power, fear, the usual reasons. Because they knew things others feared, she said. They could heal wounds that should not heal, see things before they happened, and for that, they were called witches. The word hung between them, heavy with the weight of history. Eadric had fought wars in the name of kings and gods, had seen so-called heretics burned at the stake for lesser crimes. Yet here she sat before him, flesh and blood, breathing and real, not some monstrous thing whispered about in frightened villages. "You don't fear me?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Eadric met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I fear men who pretend to be righteous while spilling innocent blood, not those who mend what others break." The words came easily, but they surprised him nonetheless. He had spent his life as a weapon, wielded by lords who cared little for the blood they spilled. But the world was not as simple as it had once seemed. For the first time in a long time, something shifted in his chest, not the fire of battle, nor the weight of duty, but something else. Isolde saw it too, though she said nothing. Some truths did not need words. The fire burned low, the embers glowing like dying stars. And in that quiet moment, they both understood. This was no longer just about survival. This was a new path, one neither had expected, but one they would walk together. Dawn broke in hues of gold and crimson, painting the sky with the promise of something more. Eadric stood, tightening the straps of his armor, feeling the familiar weight of steel on his shoulders. Isolde rose as well, pulling her cloak around her. They had both lost something to the world, but perhaps, in each other, they had found something worth keeping. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Their journey was only beginning.